When analyzing frames or even talking about what they do best, you'll hear terms thrown around a lot, like jack of all trades, controller, tank, damage, and support. These terminologies seem awfully loose at first, but believe it or not, they're fairly strict in their class groups. For example, let's look at a frame that I love, Nidus. He has good scaling damage with his 1, great CC in his 2, and his 4's maggot staggering enemies, with some buffing power in his 3, along with tons of survivability. By those standards, you would assume that he is a jack-of-all-trades frame, but he isn't. He is classified as a tank frame. The lines may be blurry at a glance, but they are actually quite simple once you start to get into it. In this video, I will explain what makes a frame fall into each category and go over some examples. Tanks are a staple in any MMORPG, so explaining them almost feels like I'm insulting your intelligence, but for continuity's sake, tank is a class designated as able to get a lot of damage dealt to them and be able to shrug it off, generally with high health pools or a lot of forms of protection. For example, Death Knights in World of Warcraft don't have a lot of ways to mitigate damage, however, they have great ways of self-healing. Gunbreakers in Final Fantasy XIV have a fair bit of ways to mitigate damage for themselves and their party, and they have a very small amount of self-healing to keep themselves in the fight. Warframe is no different. The tank class is filled with frames with ways to mitigate damage, or self-heal to sustain some punishment. Some examples of this are Nidus, Rhino, and Lavos. Nidus has Parasitic Link, which when linked to an enemy redirects up to 95% of the damage dealt to him to the target he is linked to. Rhino has his Iron Skin, which makes him immune to damage for as long as it holds. And Lavos has a self-heal with his Ophidian Bite, healing per enemy hit. Tank frames are plentiful in Warframe, as it is designed as a standard MMO, and doesn't have raids or anything like that, but whenever a big boss or event comes, you'll notice a theme with at least one tank, one support or controller, and a couple of other classes such as DPS or Jack of all trades. When looking at a frame to decide if they are a tank one, word comes to mind: survivability. If their best attribute is being able to get hit and survive, then chances are high that they generally fall into the tank class. Though a dying breed, controllers serve an important role, where their job is to CC enemies in various ways to make damaging them just a little bit easier and make it so the whole party is taking less damage. As an example, let's look at a room full of level 140 bombards. This is normally a threat to just about every other frame in the game. However, a Loki can use his radial disarm to remove their weapons from the equation, making the threat significantly less. Use the same situation, but think Vauban's Bastille or Vortex to crowd control them and render them a non-lethal threat. A few examples for what frames fall into controller would be Loki, Vauban, Vault, and Zephyr. When looking at a frame to decide if they fall into this category, consider a scenario where the aforementioned Bombard Hell is at least similar, and think if their kit's job seems to be based around making that fight a lot easier. The support class is probably the most muddied out of the pack because support and controller could have and tend to have a lot of crossover. For example, Wisp is technically classed as a support frame, though in my video for her I call her a jack of all trades like an idiot. However, her Breach Surge blinds enemies for a hefty duration and makes the scenario mentioned prior quite a breeze. What separates the supporters from the controllers is supporters lean more heavily into the keeping party alive aspect. Whereas, yes, a radial blind will keep you and the squad alive, so will a Trinity. Support class frames focus on buffing allies or debuffing enemies. Some examples of this are Trinity, Wisp, Harrow, and Oberon. Now, that's not to say these frames cannot put out damage. In fact, some have to in order to do their supporting. But it isn't their primary focus, as when they load into a lobby, their priority is keeping everyone up and in the fight. When looking at a frame to decide if they fall into this category, look at their kit and see if it primarily focuses on what seems to be around keeping the party alive or buffing them one way or another. The damage class, or as I like to call them, floor tanks. Damage throughout any MMO has a specific stereotype that's put on them as a class that only really cares about one thing: their numbers. how high your numbers are, what your DPS is looking like, if you're better than the other DPS in your party. Warframe's DPS tend to lean towards handling groups of enemies. Here's the thing about DPS frames. They are good with an asterisk, and it's a big asterisk. DPS frames are good if there isn't another frame with the same style in the group, there is a support or controller in the squad to help enable them, the mission type / tile set works well with them, and or nullifiers aren't able to interrupt them so easily. For example, if you have a Siren and an Excal in a game, that's fine, as their style of DPS is different. Excal has AoE with his blade, but that's all it is it's tied to the beam of the sword slash. So he's better focused than room clear. As Siren is good at room clear, but not good at single target. Her Spore Miasma combo helps clear rooms fairly effectively. However, if you're running an Excalibur and a Baruch, one of them, spoiler alert, it'll be the Baruch, will become effectively useless as Excalibur will beat Baruch to the punch in almost every fight. Some examples of DPS frames are Siren, Mirage, and Excalibur. Now, these frames, though classed as damage, have some minor forms of control, survivability, or supporting. Mirage has her Eclipse for survivability, Excal has Radial Blind for crowd control, and Mesa has her Shattering Shield for some survivability. What makes them a damage class is their primary focus on killing enemies. The most effective form of crowd control is putting an enemy in the dirt, never forget that. When looking at a frame to decide if they fall into this category, look at their kit and see if it focuses on AoE damage and killing enemies. Jack of all trades are the worst best class in the game. They are the best because they bring a little bit of everything, but the worst because they aren't specialized or focused in a single area, meaning they are weakened in that category. Think of it this way, damage dealers have a focus of 80% into their damage, 10% into their survivability, and 10% into their crowd control generally speaking. All classes have a spread that leans into this metric respectively to what their class defining trait is. Jack of all trades tend to lean 33% all around, meaning their damage will be outclassed, but they bring more crowd control than the damage. Then their crowd control will be outclassed by a controller, but their survivability will outclass the controller, so on and so forth. Jack of all trade frames that come to mind are Titania, Grendel, and Zaku. The ability to crowd control damage and survive/buff allies is a great power to the class, but it also limits them to ever becoming the kings of really anything. Titania is one of the best Jack of all trade frames in the game, and even with that, she gets out DPS'd by the DPS frames, crowd controlled by the crowd control frames, so on and so forth. Nidus could take practically 100% of the damage that Titania would, and Titania would die, Nidus would not. The thing of Jack of all trades is they bring everything to the table, therefore they can't do as good as something that only brings one to the table. There can never be a day where a damage is outclassed by a Jack of all trades, because then you run into the issue of why does damage exist? With that being said, if you had a 9 mil to my head and I was told to pick a class to run until the end of the game, it would be the Jack of all trades. Why? Because they have an ever-changing playstyle. When I load in with a Nidus, I already know what's good. I know what I'm doing, and I have to do that job well. When I load in with an Excal, I already know what I'm doing, and I just have to do that job well. When I load in as a Titania, I have no idea if I'm going to be using my lanterns to CC, sticking to the team with my tributes active to assist them, or popping Razor Wing and erasing enemies. With that being said, for introduction to each class, I might say Excal for damage, Rhino for tanking, Frost for the control category, and Titania is probably the best early Jack of all trades that you can receive. And as far as supports go, the easiest to receive would be probably Wisp, but I think you could also wager that you could get Titania before Wisp. I would like to thank you all for watching this video, and I hope you all enjoyed it as I enjoyed making it. I would also like to give a shout out to Orangewolf, as he is the person who made my banner for the YouTube channel and also my icon for both Discord and YouTube. Thank you so much. I appreciated the art, and I hope to see you all in the next one.